Hi, everyone. This is Patrick Donohoe. Welcome to the Wealth Standard Radio. This is episode 191. And today, our guest is none other than the father of the 401k. That's what he calls himself. His name's Ted Benna. He actually wrote the very first 401k plan back in the early 80s. And so it was a really cool interview that's coming up in just a second. But before I get to that, just wanted to give a shout out to Craig from Oregon, who sent us a really cool, flattering email about the previous podcast that we did, part of which included an interview with my 10-year-old daughter on her takeaways from the Investor Summit at Sea, which is put on by the Real Estate Guys. We had a great time. It was a really cool podcast too, so definitely go and check that out. So Craig, we are going to be responding to you and going to send out a t-shirt. So we'll get your size and so forth through email. But also for those that would want one of these really cool Paradigm Life t-shirts, just go ahead and leave us a good review on iTunes, and then just take a snapshot of it, email it to us at info@paradigmlife.net, and we will also send a t-shirt your way. Now, getting to this interview, so Ted Benna, I've known about Ted for a long time, and it was actually somewhat difficult to track him down because he doesn't do a lot of interviews. But Ted has been in, not anymore, he's retired, but he was in financial services during the 70s and 80s. And it was fascinating to hear from his own words really what happened with the transition from the pension program, which was the primary retirement vehicle back in those days, to the 401k and everything that went down. He calls the 401k a monster just because of how Wall Street has really exploited some of the features of it. And so it's going to be a really cool interview. Excited to have him on. He's going to come back in the future. But for now, I can't wait for you guys to hear about the history of the 401k. So without further ado, let's get to the interview.
This is the Wealth Standard Podcast, the gold standard in all things financial.
Thanks for being here today. I am really excited to have our next guest on. His name's Ted Benna, and Ted Benna is he's known as the father of the 401k. He's one of the first kind of individuals in the financial space to use these types of vehicles, and it's actually not a vehicle; it's more of a section in the tax code. But Ted is on the phone out of Pennsylvania, and we are going to really get into today just kind of what the true story is from the guy that actually kind of pioneered it, I guess, if that's the best way to explain it. But then also we're going to get into just what's going on today, our financial system, the pension system, the retirement system in general, and some of the things that Ted is seeing, and hopefully that will help you guys just know how to really look at the economy, society through a different lens. And hopefully Ted's lens will just maybe open some things up for you that may be opportunistic. So we'll see. But Ted, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you on.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Cool. So Ted, I think a good place to start would be just maybe get into how it all started. We don't have to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but just how'd the whole 401k start? What is it? And then how are you involved?
Okay. Patrick, it was, first of all, passed into law in the fall of 1978, and it had a delayed effective date of January of 1980. And probably the key thing to mention here is that it was intended for a very different reason than what we know today. And I'm not going to go through that history. It's on my company website if somebody wants more detail around that. But it's a fluke politically. I mean, that's the astounding thing, is that this is the primary way for people to save for retirement today, and it was never intended. It was never planned. And how I got involved in it, and there's myth and there's reality, Patrick. The myth is I was reading the IRS code with my dark eye shades on and discovered this paragraph no one ever saw before, and that's actually appeared in print, but it's not as a result of my telling anyone that. It's called creative journalism. The reality is that I interpreted this section in a very different way than what was intended, and what I added to it was the idea of an employer providing a matching contribution to employees, and then also employees being able to be participating in the program by making pre-tax contributions into it themselves. So what I actually designed is the first 401k savings plan, one with a matching employer contribution and one with employee pre-tax, contributions. And, there clearly wasn't anything in the legislation saying that you could do that, but there wasn't anything saying thou shalt not. So, I saw a possibility. Okay.
Now I remember and we'll link to the story because I know it's on your website. But wasn't the first company? I think it was a bank. It may have been a bank, but didn't the first company not go through with it?
Yeah, you're right, Patrick. I mean, I'm often asked, well, what were you doing? I mean, were you tending to, turn the retirement business upside down or whatever? I said, hey, look, I was a benefit consultant. I helped companies, employers set up and run retirement programs. And, when I got into doing creative stuff was when I had an assignment that a client wanted to do something, and, I was being paid to find a solution. And in this instance, without getting into the details, the bank wanted to restructure their retirement program, and I came up with this as a design for them that would enable them to accomplish what they were trying to do. But they didn't go ahead with it at the time because their attorney didn't want to pioneer something that was new and untested. So we actually did a plan for them probably 2-3 years later. So the first actual 401k savings plan we put in place for our own little consulting company, which had probably about 60 employees at the time, effective January 1, 1981.
Interesting. Well, obviously it's become this, it's the go-to vehicle that, everybody seems to have. Okay. So, I mean, what was going on during that time that really transitioned or morphed into the 401k being the, retirement vehicle of choice? Because I think what most people say is that companies didn't want to do pensions, and so a better alternative that kind of put them, they weren't as much on the hook or liable, was this idea of a 401k. So what is that true, or is that just kind of a misconception that's out there?
Patrick, the general thesis there is correct in many aspects, but the reason for the death of traditional pensions that pay a guaranteed income for life actually go back to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, known as ERISA, yep, which was passed in 1974. And when that was enacted, prior to that, I used to sell defined benefit pension plans for a living. I got employers to set them up and paid to do that. It became impossible after ERISA was passed, and the reason was that once ERISA was enacted, companies could no longer walk away if they had underfunded plans and get off scot-free. They the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which was established through ERISA to provide a financial safety net, gave that entity the opportunity to claim up to 20% of corporate assets. And I had one of the first plans actually went through PBGC, and I won't get into the details, but once the word began to spread around the country that if you had a pension plan, you're putting your corporate assets at risk. The word spread. I mean, accountants told, their clients, hey, look, if you don't have a pension plan, you don't want to get near one of these things. So, interestingly, the legislation that was enacted to help secure these plans is one of the key reasons for their demise. And, we'll come back to this, but another piece of it were the maximum benefit limits that, have been, were put in place with ERISA that put a cap on the benefits of the higher paid. And that cap is what is, a big reason why we now have this huge disparity between higher, the big guys, the top companies, and rank and file employees in terms of compensation.
Yep.
Because the big payoffs for the senior execs no longer were tied to the same program as the rank and file employees. So we began to get the payoffs of, 10, 20, 50, 100 million to these guys being delivered through what are known as non-qualified top hat benefit programs and stock options. And it actually, as crazy as this is, became, and still is, to the financial incentive of senior execs at big companies to personally get rid of these pension plans to help drive up the stock value and get big payoffs in doing that.
Yep.
So, so here's, this is a good point to talk a bit about why we need to be a bit concerned when legislation is in play, changing tax code and behavior, because here's a classic example where one piece of legislation that was designed to save the private pension system has had the opposite long-term impact, and another one, which added this little page and a half to the IRS Code 1978, was never intended to be a big deal, has become this humongous 401k. So, shoot, you never know what's going to happen when these guys start mucking around.
Well, it's
with the tax code.
It's the law of unintended consequences. So, when you basically kind of force the hand of government on companies that maybe are not able to meet the obligations of their pension, and now they're obligated legally, and they have to bankrupt in order to restructure. Right, that type of that is going to make companies try to find a way around it. That's what's interesting. It's like whenever they make they try to put restrictions on people to either force them to do this or influence them to do this or influence them to do that. People find a way around it, and there's a lot of sections of the tax code that's to mitigate maybe what was not intended as the original purpose of one law, but a person found a way around it, and then they're trying to make a law to mitigate that. So it's interesting just to see how with ERISA they companies were now on the hook, and then they're trying to find ways in which they can give money, whether it's retirement or so forth, to their employees, but in a way in which they don't have liability. So you're saying that based on that, that's why the 401k became this kind of go-to vehicle, because it allowed them to offer benefits to their employees without the risk associated with with ERISA and pension plans, correct?
Yeah, exactly. But also, Patrick, just to talk about this and put some numbers to it, however, and put it in perspective, because usually this doesn't happen. There were never more than 30% of the private workforce that had traditional pensions as we know it. It was far from universal. And if you work for a Fortune 500 company, you work for a hospital or a university, financial organization, bank, etc., you were likely to be covered by a pension plan. But if you worked for someone else, it was very unlikely you were going to have a pension plan. So putting this in perspective, when we say, well, all these pension plans are dying off, that's really primarily a limited number of employers, Fortune 500, and maybe take another, few thousand, of the larger companies and financial organizations. Most of the entities that have 401ks never had pension plans and never would have. They're somewhere between 550 and 650,000 401k plans in existence, and over 90% of them cover less than 100 employees. Small companies, small employers, that didn't have pensions and never would have. And there's one other point here. While I haven't mind, Patrick, ramble on here too long, but there's a perception that defined benefit plans are wonderful, and they are if you spend 20 or 30 years working for the same employer. But if you go from employer to employer, the value of a traditional pension is back-end loaded. It builds primarily from ages 50 to 65. Mm-hmm. So, if you move 22 years old, you change employers 3-4 times before you hit age 50, you build up very puny small benefits if you're covered under a pension plan during that period. So that's a fact that's, kind of got to be realistically looked at in our new employees today. How many of new workers coming into the workforce are going to be fortunate enough to spend 30 years working in one place? Probably not very many.
No, not at all. And I'd also say that it's an interesting statistic that 30% of the workforce at that time had a defined benefit or a pension plan. But today there's such if a company has a 401k, I think it's like it's like 70 or 80% or some high percentage of the employees have to be under that plan, correct, or offer that plan?
Well, there are eligibility rules that really don't tie any specific percentage. I mean, generally in most companies, Patrick, if you've been there anywhere from a month to a year, you're going to be eligible for the plan if you work more than 20 hours a week. So they're universally available. I think what you're hitting at is the fact that maybe only, on average, 75% actually participate given the opportunity. So, that's one of the weaknesses certainly that's cited is the fact that, there are 25% or so who don't participate if given the opportunity. And, so that's a problem. And, there have been movements to correcting that, and by doing what's called automatic enrollment, that you reverse the way it works, and rather than you're deciding you want to be in the 401k, you're automatically put in it, and you have to elect out of it. Well, that's one of the things that helps to drive up participation rate.
Yeah, that was the Pension Protection Act that did that, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I'd like to see that expanded, actually, Patrick, to require companies, if they offer a 401k, require them that they have to automatically enroll in the employees. Mm-hmm. Right now it's an option; they're not required. And the other big plus was part of that is, annually ratcheting up the contribution level. So employee might be enrolled automatically at 3% of pay, and then bumped up 1% a year, up to 6% or so that it improves the potential that an employee will have a successful outcome. Now, I get people who, when I make that kind of comment, come back and say, what in the world are you? You big government guy? And I say, hey, look, participants have the option to pull the plug on that. It's not a matter that they're forced to do it. It just, they have to reverse and elect not to participate rather than the other way. It's that simple. It's not something they're locked in. If they don't want to do it, well, they have the option to pull out of it.
Got it. So today, if you look at, and this is, if you fast forward to the environment today, we have a lot of people that are, putting money into these plans. There's trillions of dollars in assets in 401ks, but a lot of it's tied to securities, tied to mutual funds, tied to these new target date funds. Okay, so what's your perspective on the 401k system you see today, and if it's going to accomplish the objective that most people think it's going to accomplish?
Man, that's such a huge question that, I have to decide, well, what piece of it do I want to bite off, Patrick? Let me just kind of boil it down to some key points here. The investment part of it's become much more complicated than it should be. Participants are confused. They're given too many choices. That can be simplified. There's ways of getting around that and making it a whole lot better. The cost of investment is much too high in many of these plans, particularly in the smaller market, and that needs to be dealt with. And we don't have time to get into how that might take place. But the biggest question you're raising here is it going to meet people's expectations? Are they going to be able to march off into retirement with a comfortable retirement income? And, the reality is many are not. This is hard work. It's something you need to get your head in the game early on in your working career, know how much you need to be saving, and, doing that regularly, and, investing it, and, not panicking, during your working years as you're building your amount for retirement. When you have the ups and downs, you got to live through them. And, then when you're reaching retirement, you need to get help make some really smart decisions at that stage of your life. So it takes a lot of effort.
So looking at, what else you're seeing today, I mean, there's, just the whole retirement idea. I think it's interesting to see how society has changed and the whole perspective of retirement, because, back when I would say ERISA was created, I mean, most individuals, they looked at retirement differently because it was they had a career. They were at a company for 30, 35 or longer years, and then their retirement wasn't up to 90 years old or 95. I mean, they may be 10 years in retirement. So the retirement period was a lot shorter. At least that's what my understanding is. And so looking at where we're at today, I mean, the belief about where you should be at retirement age, and then also how much money you need specifically, it really hasn't changed that much, or has it?
No, you're right on, Patrick. It's changed dramatically because when we go back to when Social Security began and we started to see pensions emerge, you were dealing largely with male workforce. Many who worked in hard labor environment, and if they retired at age 65, typically lived for 10 to 12 years, and that was it. And we've now gotten to a point where retirement being a 20, 30-year event is certainly, very realistic. And if you take 10 versus 30 years and you use a modest 3% inflation rate during those 30 years, you need 5 times as much money to survive during your retirement as you do with 10 years. And, the reason it's 5 rather than 3 times is because of the impact of inflation. And forget the source, whether it's Social Security, part company, part your own. The reality is you need 5 times as much money. And that gets to fundamental issue here that I strongly believe in, and that is, I don't think our Creator created us to sit around for 20, 30 years doing nothing. So, I think many people need to think maybe about other streams of income, maybe, some of that even being through some form of employment, longer than, what has been anticipated.
No, and that's the intriguing part about, what's coming down the line is I don't even think that's going to be an option. I think that's going to be almost mandatory for most, and they're not expecting that. And that's what I think will be hard. But you do, and I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail here, but there's this kind of new idea of boomer reinvention, where it's basically saying the exact same thing we are, but it's saying it to those that maybe still have 5-10 years left before they think they're at that retirement age, or what they've always considered as their retirement age. And at that point, it's preparing to either be a consultant or take the skills that they've built over the years and do something on a contract basis or work part-time or something like that. Because again, it's just to save the amount of money that's going to be required for pretty much the same period of time that you've worked it's unrealistic mathematically. And that's what my point was, is the idea behind 60 or 65 years old really hasn't changed in 30 years or more. But the other characteristics associated with the reality and the probability of that have all changed. So it's interesting just to see kind of where we're at there. But I mean, that might be a good time to transition to really some other kind of core issues that are at hand, because you are an expert. That's what has been your field in retirement income and defined benefit plans and pension plans. I mean, right now the things that I see, and I'd love to get your take on and your perspective on, is, what is going on with the pension system today? Because you do have, the pension guarantee, the pension guarantee corp, and that is, essentially more of like an FDIC to an extent to pensions. But right now the pension problem is so big, whether it's, CalPERS and their underfunded amount, or New Jersey and other parts of the East Coast. And then you've also had a lot of, changes with existing municipalities like Detroit, for instance, going bankrupt, and then other issues in California and some of those municipalities. I mean, what are you seeing from like the pension side of things with how they're set up, the underfunded amount that they're almost all facing, and then we can maybe segue into Social Security, which is a very similar dynamic.
Yeah, I commented a little bit earlier on it, and the fundamental problem here, Patrick, is that people have a very false sense of security under these pension systems, including Social Security, that, it's locked in and guaranteed, and, they can count on it. And in some states, I know, Pennsylvania here, I read that, they feel that way because these benefits are constitutionally guaranteed. And so they say, hey, well, you can't reduce it or take it away. It's, constitutionally locked in. But the hard reality is these programs are all underfunded, severely underfunded, Patrick. And you mentioned the PBGC, which, deals with the private sector. And just taking that one for a moment for, your listeners who are, covered under a private pension, my advice normally is that if you're at retirement age and you have the opportunity to take a lump sum rather than locking into, an annuity, through your employer in that system, I would seriously consider taking the lump sum. And if you want to lock into an annuitized income stream, do it outside in the in the private sector through, strong insurance companies who are in that business and have been for hundreds of years. And the reason I make that recommendation to consider that, even if the monthly amount may be a little lower, is that when you stay in the private pension system with PBGC backing, you are participating in a national pool that has more liabilities than assets. And, there's an expectation at some point that that's going to hit the skids, but there will be a bailout. And, I don't think there will be a bailout. I think benefits ultimately in that system are going to have to be cut back to the level of assets that are available. Now, on the private sector, if you annuitize with an insurance company, as you well know, you have the assets of that entity, and if you're sticking with companies that have been around, for a couple hundred years or whatever, they're financially solid. But in addition, you have the state insurance funds behind it, and those funds have actual assets rather than liabilities, as you know, Patrick.
No,
they have actual assets there.
Yeah. No, and that's where, you always go to the solution, and the government trying to replicate even a company to an extent replicate kind of the private the private side of creating solutions like an insurance company. It's never going to do as well, and that's really, I would say, with Social Security. I mean, it may have been a good idea in the beginning to an extent based on the problems that it was solving, because it was more for widows and orphans type of protection. But now that's morphed also into something very similar, where it does have a lot of obligations that it's promised, backed by the government, but yet it faces the same thing as public pensions and private pensions, where the underlying assets are simply not there. And the idea is that people feel the same thing as they do with a pension, probably even stronger, where it's, well, I've paid into Social Security for 30 years, they should be paying me for my 30 years, So what do you, as we kind of touch on all of these different issues, which really have some of the same fundamental flaws, what's your take and opinion about Social Security? I'll
tell you a story, Patrick. It's relevant to and timely, and that is, back in President Clinton's time, he established a 28-member commission to study Social Security, and consisted of private, public sector, leading members of both parties, and they came together, had very divergent views, and at the end of it, they unanimously agreed to support a set of changes that would have some tax increases and cut benefits. I mean, that's where you go, okay? I was at a board meeting in Washington with two of the members of that commission, Senator John Breaux and David Walker, who I know you're familiar with, and highly respected individual. And so Senator Breaux, both of them were on that commission, and so Senator Breaux did a presentation to our group, and he started off by saying, we got a problem here. In around 2030, we're going to run out of money. And I thought, well, that's encouraging. At least we're getting, a Democratic leader here saying, ultimately we have some problem here. And that's always a debate, whether there is or isn't a problem. So during the Q&A time, I couldn't resist. I asked him, I said, well, I'm not an economist or an actuary, maybe that's my deficiency here, but are we going to have a problem around 2014 when the cash flow for the retirement part of the system goes negative? Meaning the benefits being paid out exceed revenues being collected. Yep. And he didn't know how to answer the question. He hemmed and hawed around for a while, and finally he answered and said, folks, we're going to protect this if we have to print money.
Oh, God.
And I went home, and as I tell people, I said, well, I can sleep better now knowing that, they got this thing covered. And, that was years ago. And, unfortunately, the recommendations they made never got, they never went anywhere because Clinton got into his mess then, and, that just killed, anything happening. And so the problem is, there is a fundamental problem here. And, the longer it goes without being addressed, the more draconian the changes will be when they come, and, they will come. Now, I have a recommendation I've been throwing out right now is just a minor piece of dealing with Social Security, and the first one is to stop bringing new workers into the system and to take, new workers coming into the workforce and actually have their contributions and their employers' contributions to the retirement part of it go into the federal thrift and savings plan, which you probably are familiar with. Yep. Is a pretty strong program that has real assets, is well managed, and with low expenses, and give these new workers coming in at least the knowledge that they've got a real account with real money rather than this phantom thing that they have little or no confidence in. And then the other thing would be to take the the Clinton that team's recommendations, dust them off, and get them on the table and seriously pursue doing something with them.
Yeah, because something has to be done, and this is my from my study and understanding. I want to make sure that I'm on par here. But with Social Security, there's no assets in Social Security either. Technically speaking, they're more of just obligation, like they're just government securities that are just obligations of the government to pay out. Correct? There's not really any cash there.
Patrick, the way I describe it is if you were allowed to borrow 100% of your 401k account, personally, mm-hmm. and when you retired, you had borrowed 100% of it and loaned it to yourself, how much retirement income would it provide you? And that's what's happened here. The government has borrowed these supposedly assets from the Social Security Trust Fund and spent them. So that's reality. Now, the worst part actually of the Social Security program, and one that's got to come to a head this year, is the disability program. Yep. And you may be in tune with this, that it is such a disaster and boondoggle. That program doesn't have any money.
They have no money. Nothing.
And it'll be, interesting test politically here that there are two choices on the table. Probably they're going to be considered. One is to reduce the benefits to social, disability recipients to the level that there are current tax revenues to fund it, or to raid the supposed retirement part of it and start to use monies from there to pay, to support the existing disability system. And it's going to be very interesting politically, to see how that plays out this year.
Well, and I think that also, whatever does happen from that will give us kind of a sign of the bigger issue at hand, which is just, Social Security, and I guess you can even lump Medicare into it, because that has just as many issues as Social Security. But I mean, these are, in a sense, these are debts, these are obligations that are kept off of the balance sheet of the United States, and that's also somewhat misleading, I would say, because right now, it's the touted, $20 trillion of debt that we have. A lot of that is, some of it is budget deficit. But then adding on to that is, I think David Walker was one of the first really just, I don't know, if a flag bearer saying that we have major issues we need to change. And if not, there's going to be heck to pay. And he said that before, 2008, 2009. So it was,
right.
So that's where it's, a lot of these issues are going to come home to roost. But maybe as we kind of like wrap up our thoughts, like what are some things that you're paying attention to? What's maybe keeping you up at night? Because I know that you are at really have concluded your career to an extent, but you're still out doing interviews and writing and trying to get messages out there. I mean, what message are you sending based on what you are seeing out there that's of concern to you?
Patrick, I like to focus on things that have some potential of being useful. Okay, there are ideas out there, and I won't throw names to them, but people have some ideas relative to restructuring the whole system and so forth that probably have little potential politically of going anywhere. So, right now there are the three things that I'm focusing my energies on. One of them is continuing to help to put the spotlight on the fees that are being paid by investors that including IRAs and 457s and 403bs that are much higher than what they should be. That's one area. The next one is actually, we didn't talk about it. We talked about the fact that one of the gaps is that only about 75% of people who have access to 401k contribute, but there's roughly almost 50% of the workforce that have no opportunity to save through any employer-related retirement program. And, I'm working on some ideas for something very simple and easy, for employers that haven't gone the typical 401k route. And the last thing is totally different altogether, and that's helping to actually raise funds for Compassion International, which is an organization that if you're not familiar with it at all, that does some really great things that getting support, individuals to support to a young child in some part of the world that might otherwise not survive to adulthood, and also doing things like investing in communities by providing clean water and maybe buying a sewing machine for a young lady who's caught in sex trafficking, or a single mom, or buying a goat or chickens or whatever, to help families get self-supporting. And
are you referring to more like the micro lending? Is that what you're referring to?
That could be part of it, exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yep. Yeah. Actually, doing meaningful things to other than just necessarily handout programs, but making a major difference in individualizing. The whole idea came to mind with me is I'm often asked, did you ever think of getting a patent or a copyright? And I said, yeah, we tried that, but we're told that we couldn't do that. So my pitch here is that, hey, look, if you benefited from 401k as a participant, or as someone who makes a living perhaps in that side of the business, hey, as a thank you, sponsor a child, or make a one-time gift to do something for Compassion International. Would do that as a thank you.
Okay, yeah, we'll make sure we put that link on the as well as your website on the show notes. But yeah, we probably just scratched the surface, Ted, because I know there's a lot there's a lot you're seeing. You have a tremendous history, and you've been able to see kind of this, what's occurred in our society regarding finance and retirement. And I think we hit on some really good points, which is obviously, there's some things that weren't intended to happen that ended up being a very significant part of our culture. In this case, the 401k. But then also it's just this idea behind retirement, and I think that I believe that it's kind of like anti-life just to stop producing, right? To stop contributing. I think everyone will always have something to contribute throughout their entire life, and so I think just the notion of retirement is it's going to lead to probably a less fulfilling life, even though people think it's going to be more fulfilling. So I would say also, it's the idea behind the underlying issue behind just whether it's retirement or financial planning or saving. It rarely is the vehicle, right? The vehicle is just a tool, whether it's a 401k or whether it's an IRA, whether it's insurance or an annuity, a lot of which we've mentioned here. And in the end, I think you hit on it, but very briefly, just people need to really understand what they're doing. They need to become educated. They don't, I would say, putting trust in a system that has not performed. It's one of the definitions of insanity, right? It's not like it's just gonna change overnight. I think people taking responsibility for how they're making money, taking responsibility for where they're putting the money is paramount. And I think if really there was some more accountability there, people really understood what they were doing, we'd be in a different situation. And then I'd say that looking at the fundamental issues, there's a lot, and just how it's going to what's going to solve your problems versus what's going to solve the system's problems. I mean, it's I don't think we can really predict what's going to solve the system's problems, but you can influence it anyway. But what you can influence, what you can control is your life and what you do, and that's just through taking ownership and being accountable. But do you have any? Maybe as we conclude, we'll definitely have you back on if you're willing, because I know there's a lot of things.
You triggered a couple quick thoughts, Patrick.
Okay.
If I can add them.
Absolutely.
Every system, no matter what it might be, is humanly designed as imperfect. So, if we kill off all the existing systems and do something new, they'll have their own set of problems. I mean, that's reality. And all these systems, when we talk about retirement and income for retirement, require money to be invested. And, the pain here, let's say in 401k or whatever, isn't the underlying structure. It's what happens on the investment side. And no matter what the system is, you got to put the money somewhere, and go through that pain. That's point number one. The second one is, I was on a flight recently to California, and I was sitting next to a lady that she says, "Are you retired?" And I got this silly grin on my face, and she wondered, well, what's going on here? And so I had to say, look, I'm 75 years old. I've spent a career helping employers set up and run their retirement programs, and I'm kind of sitting here with this grin on my face because I can't quite picture being retired yet, where I'm not actively engaged in something productive. I'm not ready for that yet. So I'll end with that.
Okay, well and I obviously I'm not there yet, but as I look at just there's still leaders out there. I mean, I was on an investment summit this past week. And one of the speakers was Robert Kiyosaki, and also Ed Griffin. I'm not sure if you know who he is, but Kiyosaki is very well known. But he turned 70 last week, and he's going just as strong as he was before. And Ed Griffin, who wrote that treatise on the Federal Reserve, the creature from Jekyll Island. He's in his mid 80s, but they're still going because they believe passionately in something, and they found something that fulfills them, and they don't necessarily consider it a job. I mean, it's what their life is. And I think if people really I don't know, at least for me, it's if you're doing something that you don't like and you want to retire from something that you don't like, retirement isn't the solution. It's finding something that you like to do. And you can tell, with your history and what you do and continuing to participate in media and writing, that you do find some fulfillment in that. I just think that's natural. So for those who are retiring, it's one of those things where life is. There's a principle of life where continuing to contribute is the only way to live. It's the only way to be fulfilled and achieve. And if you don't have that, then it suddenly becomes less meaningful.
Great, Patrick. Hey, enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Wealth Standard Podcast, the gold standard in all things financial.